In this lesson, we'll introduce the puzzles of nature as they presented themselves to naturalists in the 1800s. In a future lesson, we'll contrast the worldviews of Christian thinkers like William Paley with biologists like Charles Darwin. But first, we'll lay out the puzzles as they existed in the 1800s. The first thing that naturalists were trying to explain was species origin. Where did species come from? Now, species are just populations of living organisms that interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And the question was, where did they come from? And why were there so many different kinds of species? And why were there so many species? In this slide, we see some of the vertebrates, for example, fish, an amphibian, a couple of reptiles, and some mammals species. And in this slide, we see 4 different bird species. There are species that don't have backbones. They're invertebrates. We have a bee and a sea urchin and a sea dragon and a crab here. And then, of course, there are plants, many different kinds of plants. And they are interesting because they can capture sunlight energy to perform photosynthesis. They can make their own food. But again, there are many different kinds of plant species. So where did they all come from? And in more modern times, we can add to this list of puzzles the origin of life. How did life begin on Earth? 4.5 billion years ago, Earth was a lifeless rock. Today, it is teeming with millions of species. How did this happen? And connected with the origin of life is the fundamental question, what is life? The second puzzle is the appearance of design in living things, what biologists call adaptations. Now, adaptations are features of creatures that help the organism survive and reproduce in its natural environment. So the praying mantis has many different kinds of adaptations. We can think of them as parts with purpose. They serve a function, and that function is to help the organism survive and reproduce. Here we see the mantis. For example, it's got large eyes to track its prey. It actually has a neck that permits swiveling. A lot of insects can't do this, but the mantis can move its head on its neck so as to, again, better track prey. And really noticeably, it has these spikes on its forelimbs, and the spikes serve a purpose. They help to immobilize prey when the mantis eats. So these are parts with purpose. Biologists call them adaptations. Now, it's interesting to notice these parts with purpose in living things because when we look around at the non-living world, we don't see purpose in nature. For example, the moon doesn't purposely orbit the Earth, nor does the sun purposely orbit the Milky Way galaxy. This is a picture of the Milky Way galaxy taken from Joshua Tree National Park. This is a galaxy, our neighbor Andromeda galaxy. If it were the Milky Way, we would imagine our sun sort of revolving around the Milky Way, right? And we don't understand there to be a purpose to this movement. The solar eclipse does not serve the sun, earth, or moon's interest. In 2017, there was a solar eclipse, and these photos were taken in Idaho Falls. Here we see the sun with the moon's shadow sort of increasing and blocking out the sun. Here's a picture of totality. We can see some of the solar prominences. This is a GoPro picture of the scene during totality. And zooming in, we see the moon in front of the sun here. But the point is, when we look around at the celestial objects, we don't detect purposeful behavior. None of these objects have an interest. Ice doesn't float and water doesn't run downhill for its own benefit. Again, in the non-living world, we don't detect purpose. But with living things, they distinguish themselves by having parts with purpose. And so that is our second puzzle, these adaptations. How did they come to be? We can rephrase that puzzle as, how did purpose enter the universe? If the events described by physics and chemistry have no purpose, why does biology describe things with purpose? Puzzle number 3 would be species extinction, the disappearance of organisms. Now, the fossil record in the 1800s was not as good as it is today. Nevertheless, scientists were noticing that there were creatures being discovered in the fossils that didn't exist at the time. So, for example, dinosaurs clearly didn't exist anymore, and this posed a puzzle. what happened to these organisms. Puzzle number 4 had to do with the ability for biologists to classify organisms into groups within groups. So classification systems are based on shared traits. There's similarities between species. You might be familiar with the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species system. If we just consider the 3 cat species over here, we can see what the puzzle is here. Here we have a domestic cat, a tiger, and a lion. Now they share many traits. So we can identify many similarities between these 3 as compared to, say, a wolf. So these 3 have more traits in common than any of them do with a wolf. And we're going to call that groupishness. Why is it that some species can be grouped closer together in a sense, or put in the same group compared to other species that don't fit in that group? For example, in this slide here, we see 3 species that seem to belong in a group and a 4th one that doesn't belong. We've got 3 mammals here, and then we've got the grasshopper, the insect. This is an orangutan, a tiger, and a panda bear. And again, the question then for naturalists was, why is it that these 3 have more shared characteristics than they do with this one down here? We're going to call that the puzzle of groupishness. Now these 4 puzzles then were the historical puzzles facing naturalists of the 1800s. And Mr. Darwin, the biologist, is going to come along and propose solutions to the puzzle. And after he did so, it raised another immediate puzzle. And that, we'll call this puzzle number 5, human origins. Now Darwin's going to argue that the human species is just another animal species. But it did raise questions then. How did we get our unique characteristics, our intelligence, our moral capacity? So this will be our 5th puzzle, human origins and the nature and the evolution of our unique qualities. And in modern times, we'll add a couple more puzzles. Why do we age and die? Here we see a human female giving birth. That child will grow up, achieve adulthood, but then begin to age and ultimately die. Now, aging is the loss of function over time. So it is something. All living things can be killed. All living things can die. But aging means something special. It means that as time goes by, that living individual deteriorates over time. There is a loss of function. And so that question then is, we can sort of raise a couple of different kinds of questions connected to aging. You know, species have different maximum lifespans. Why is this? Why do some species, the individuals, live for a long amount of time and others have very short lifespans? And in fact, biologists have noted that some species don't seem to age at all. And why is this? Now, the species that don't age tend to be simpler kinds of organisms, single-celled organisms, for example. Another question connected with the aging question sounds sort of strange to put it this way, but why are we born young? Now remember, the idea is an individual over their lifetime ages and then dies. But the human species itself doesn't seem to be aging over the millennia. Right? So there's something that's rejuvenating each generation, that human offspring, are born young. Yet individuals will age and die, but generations don't seem to age. There's some kind of rejuvenating process that goes on in the act of reproduction. So while individuals age, why doesn't our species age? The final puzzle for this lesson will be, why is sex so common? Sexual reproduction, that is. Now, it is by far the most common form of reproduction. Now, there are organisms that clone themselves. Bacteria, for example, clone themselves. So we're going to have to ask the question, well, why did sex evolve? Were there some benefits to sexual reproduction as opposed to cloning? And connected with that, why are there genders? Why are there males and females? And so in this course, we will attempt to address the following puzzles to answer the following questions: species origin, diversity and number, And what is life? How did it begin on Earth? The appearance of design in nature, what biologists call adaptations. How did purpose enter the universe, these parts with purposes? Species extinction and disappearance. Classification of species, what we will call groupishness. And human origins and our unique characteristics. And aging and death and sex and gender.